Welcome back to Behind the Checkout, the podcast where we explore the biggest ideas in payments. I'm John Lunn, CEO and co-founder of Gravy. Let's start with one number. Nearly 8 in 10 enterprise merchants are actively considering switching payment service providers. Most won't, but that gap tells us something. Enterprise merchants now treat payments as a strategic function, with dedicated teams, their own data, and ambitious roadmaps. The question is whether PSPs are evolving at the same pace. To explore that, I'm joined by Michal, Principal Consultant and Practice Lead at Payments Teams Consultancy. Michal recently led research with enterprise merchants on exactly this topic. Michal, welcome to the show.
Hi, John. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I have to be honest. I read the report, music to my ears. I love what it says. But let's start there. You ran the research with all these enterprise merchants on their PSP relationships. What surprised you the most?
Well, I think partially the number that you just quoted. So we obviously work with merchants, with enterprise merchants all the time, and we are not surprised that there's always a desire to improve within our client group. This research was quite broad, so we have surveyed almost 60 globally leading enterprise merchants, most of them based in Europe, but still with global operations from a a variety of different verticals. And I think what was interesting for us is that the level of consideration to switch and to look at new capabilities and new providers is very high. We're not seeing as much of a movement in that space, and I think that's probably one surprising factor at this stage. It's quite normal for a lot of our clients to be obviously thinking about what the future might look like and wanting a different environment, but actually not sort of pressing the trigger. But I think what research is showing is that there are now more options for merchants to potentially expand their provider relationships, their ecosystem, and to build more without necessarily changing the relationship with their main PSP. And I think that's the main story of this piece.
Excellent.
And I think the other piece that's coming out of this is certainly the fact that there's quite a lot of differentiation within the merchant pool. We are seeing that the general level of satisfaction is fairly high. So people are just kind of think that their PSP is probably good, but there's also a lot of merchants who, for instance, don't track or know their authorization rates, or who don't really know their fraud rates either. So you can see that there's quite a lot of differentiation within that peer group.
So the headline question, or we'll go straight to that, is are PSPs moving the same speed as leading merchants, or is there a gap between what the have built and what the merchants want? Is that what is driving this?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think, and you'll know this because you've been in this industry longer than I have. Is that obviously it depends on what we understand by leading merchants, and also we look at at the actual landscape of PSPs, right? Because we have different waves of PSPs have their strengths that have grown out of specific phases of development. First of obviously of our present, and then sort of e-commerce, and I think we have now a quite a differentiated market with where we have what we often think as leading PSPs as being some of the global platforms that perhaps have built their own in-house orchestration layers or solutions, and have 40 strong and more payment sort of engineering teams. But that's obviously not necessarily the bread and butter of most merchants, and that includes most enterprise merchants, right? So I think we do have now quite a diverse set of merchants and PSP players. One of the important aspects for our work at Payment Genes is that we don't believe that one size fits all. And for us, the first question whenever we are approached by a merchant is, how do we align your provider strategy and your overall payment strategy with your business, which means both your business strategic goals. Are you trying to cut costs? Are you trying to increase conversions? Are you looking at global expansions? How are we going to be manage these markets outside of your core geographies, for instance? What kind of businesses is this? Are you selling goods with a short or a long fulfillment period? So a lot of these things that actually come into play to understand who's the best provider for you, and there isn't really a sort of a simple answer to this question.
So your research showed so this 8 out of 10, I think is actually 83%. So let's use the percentage of merchants considering switching provider. But then you also say in the research that few actually end up doing it. Why is that? Is that just purely because they're satisfied, or is it just the friction of moving?
Well, the research suggests a couple of things. So the most obvious one, so we did ask about specific reasons for not switching or barriers for switching. And the one that's quoted the most is integration complexity. And that's basically inhibited. There's obviously a barrier. And I mean, if you're using, well, you're talking about enterprise merchants who haven't used tokenization because that's a completely different story
Yeah.
and things be rare. But if you're using your own PSP, tokenization and vaulting, obviously there are some and there are other considerations for moving providers, and that's obviously becomes quite difficult. It was quite interesting that even from other projects where you're looking at the number of PSPs who looks, for instance, use scheme tokenization or external or third-party voting, that was very much a minority, and so that sort of ability to move providers was just not often there, right? Because that, to me, also tells me that perhaps some elements of why I would actually make the move to another provider because of those added value services, or because you are able to potentially have the benefits in terms of revenue, is just not as easily to quantify as very basic questions around integration timeline, switching costs, and or of course the headline pricing. And headline pricing for very large merchants doesn't tend to be that distinct between providers within the same category, right? So we're typically looking at, as long as there is a decent negotiation there, we typically looking at very small differences between providers who engage in that final process. So I think just the lack of awareness of some of the opportunities or some of the benefits that new capability could potentially bring also plays a role.
And it's something that we see often when we start talking about auth rates or looking at auth rates. It really depends very heavily on what business you're in, right? And I think we have merchants that come to us and go, my auth rate's in the top 80, so it's terrible. I'm losing 12%. We're like, but you're in a high risk product set, or you're selling something. This is actually great for your industry, but the information isn't really out there. Like the people need to work with the likes of your company and others to say, what should it be? Because it's very hard for you to benchmark your auth rates.
No, and I think PSPs are not particularly happy to share this either. So the most common complaint is that we're getting KPIs, we don't know what they mean.
Yes.
And, we're getting something, but are we in the top 5%? And if we are not in the top 5%, what can we do to get in the top 5% or 2%, 1%, whatever that is? And that is probably what most enterprise merchants expect from their primary payment provider, and that's what they're not typically seeing.
So what do specifically, what do you think merchants feel that their PSPs are falling behind on? Is it pricing? I think we said no. Is it product gaps? Is it global coverage, data access, or just, how quick they are, customer support, any of that? What is the driver here? Where do the merchants feel most friction?
So there seems to be two different sets of criteria that merchants are using. So there are criteria that merchants are using for purely for provider selection, and this is still dominated largely by price as well as obvious elements such as coverage, and by coverage I mean geographic as well as payment method coverage. There is, I would say, quite a varied level of sophistication when it then comes to what coverage then means in terms of potential local acquiring and so on. So that depends on the level of maturity of the merchant, also the type of expansion they're looking at, and to what extent they actually think of that international presence of being primary. and then obviously things like settlement currencies and so on. So that might play different roles for different merchants. But I would say pricing is still very well key for sure at selection. In terms of staying with a merchant and with a sorry, in terms of staying with a PSP and actually keeping the volume with that PSP, then you're actually starting looking at other factors, and you're looking at obviously fraud rates or chargeback rates, specifically because this is something where many merchants have under invest in terms of capabilities, and we've seen very large merchants just unable to defend chargebacks on a very very regular basis. And so that's obviously one kind of moment of truth, is that okay, our pricing is fine, but there's something wrong from a risk perspective, and that obviously creates some cost pressures. But usually the moment of exploration of a potential additional provider or an orchestrator to add providers tends to be when we see that the core solution that the initial or the main PSPs has been providing doesn't anymore fit the strategy of the merchant. So that might be because of market expansion, and so looking at increased coverage, so that coverage no longer tracks, or in terms of product roadmap flexibility, might be around subscriptions, might be around being able to support certain payment methods. So it becomes that become crucial for certain industries. Or it might be looking at authorization rates that we have previously discussed, and I think that often comes from a perception that authorization rates are too low, which might not be true, but it might be that perception is already in gray there, and they will look for it for a different provider.
Merchants seem to not, I mean, in the old days, you would just rip one out and put a new one in, right? That tended to be the way that merchants would do it. I think what we're seeing now and what your report is showing is merchants are choosing optionality over full replacement, often through orchestration or doing it themselves. They're looking for multi-acquiring RFPs that we're seeing anywhere very much around renegotiating and not purely replacing. Is that, I think, I'm assuming that's a healthy evolution, or is there a workaround to a relationship that isn't working? What is driving optionality over just pure replacement?
Yes, so I think partially this is still around friction and the fact that it is difficult to change your main provider. It might also be because simply you are quite happy with your main provider, and if you have a very good deal around cards in Europe, why would you be going with someone who might maybe not have certain European payment methods, maybe have a very good card coverage globally, but doesn't support BLIC in Poland, right? But you do want to have someone who can do Pix in Brazil because you are deciding to expand to Brazil, and therefore that's key to you. So I think we're seeing certainly a bit of a pick and mix approach to capabilities for sure. And instead of merchants asking themselves questions, what is the provider that's going to fit the single provider is going to fit our strategy for the next 5 years, they're asking to say this question: what is the next capability we need? And typically what will happen is they will have a conversation with their primary PSP and say, well, is Pix on your roadmap? And they'll say yes, but we don't know when. And I say, okay, well, in that case, well, we do need Brazil in 3 months, so we will talk to someone else.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, put in pure engineering speak, it's and not or, right? That's what we're seeing is like, instead of having to replace your entire PSP because you want Pix in Brazil, put in orchestration and then do Pix in Brazil outside your PSP, maybe directly with Pix or with a Brazilian provider. So I think that optionality of not having to make one big decision, and in the old days, it very much was down to, well, PSP would say to you, if you give me all your volume, I will give you slightly better pricing. But as you said, pricing's kind of driving down and all getting very similar. So that's not really the question anymore. So I think that's healthy. It's good to have choices. It always makes things better, but we're seeing that as a big driver from our side. So enterprise merchants are often moving into new markets faster than their providers can. And, it's very hard to build out multiple, especially if you're a PSP is acting as a master merchant, it's very hard to expand into new countries. There's regulations, there's licenses you need. And from my PayPal background, I remember, I'm not going to say which country, but it took us 6 years to get a license in one country at one stage. So where does the coverage break down first for a merchant, and how is a merchant solving for that today?
I think it's a combination of what's happening on the merchant side and what's happening on the market side. So you would not have. I remember working with a certain scheme in Poland a while ago, and I think the view was that Blik is not going to be a particularly important competitor. This is too much friction, too many steps to make a payment. Doesn't feel like it's a step towards the future if you compare that to a card on file, sort of user experience. But as we know now, it is the dominant payment method in e-commerce. And then we do still have global merchants that are using PSPs that do not in any way support Blik, right? And that does mean that you are going to be losing volume, you're going to be losing customers. And so I think this is something that is not necessarily also always coming from a change in the merchant strategy. It's often coming from basically the lack of change in strategy, but actually the market itself changing and merchants being a little bit slow to react. Sometimes that is because a lot of the payment teams may have been historically small, often, relying on that single PSP relationship. But now we see that over half of the surveyed merchants had multi-PSP relationship, which does mean that there's the need for that management. And I think what we're seeing is that because there's these multi-PSP relationships, over half of the merchants we've surveyed have those. There's also a way stronger need to actually have a single source of truth for all these things. So what are we actually tracking? How are we going to optimize this and so on? So I think that is also creating those second order effects on then thinking, well, we maybe need some kind of an orchestration solution, right? Because you are starting to think about how do we optimize, how do we add new payment methods most efficiently, how do we track where things go wrong. And so it's not just about what merchants do, it's also when merchants don't do anything and
Yeah.
the reality sort of hits them.
Now, often the merchant doesn't know, right? I think like I'm from Switzerland and I live in the US, right? And you only when I go back to Switzerland and I realize that everybody's playing for everything with a local payment method, which most people in the US haven't heard for, and then you go and see a US merchant and say, "Oh, you're selling into Switzerland. Do you support Twin?" And they'll go, "What is that?" And they're like, unless you're there on the ground, you don't realize that a huge amount of Swiss people don't have a Visa or a MasterCard. They only have this local payment type. And so it's education is hard, and it's hard to find that information. And again, that's why people like yourselves exist and have jobs, right? Is because most people don't know.
Well, and your PSP will not tell you this unless they are supported already. And even
Exactly.
then, it might be a bit iffy depending on how their actual economics works on these payment methods. So it might be a conversation that will happen only when it's forced, right?
Uh-huh.
So we really want to turn on these payment methods, or do you really have to?
Yeah.
So so that is certainly something that comes from inaction as well as from conscious triggers such as market expansion, going to new geographies, which obviously we see all the time as well.
Yeah, we also get a sort of what I call the kid in the candy shop a little bit as well, where a merchant will say, "Okay, I'm going to Indonesia. I need 18 payment methods," and you're like, "Yeah, but you'll get 5 transactions a year from each, right?" So there is a little bit of that. It's not necessarily you need everything, but just because they exist, you don't need it. But you need to have a balance of what is actually going to give me volume, what's going to give me fraud protections as well. In many cases, some of these payment methods don't come with a lot of background, a lot of protection. And then when it comes to settlement, these things can become an absolute nightmare. We've seen payment methods with 30-day settlements. And if you're the poor person in accounts whose job is to do reconciliation, then your life is about to get considerably worse. So if you were sitting in front of a PSP's leadership team today, what would the one thing you tell them they need to do to close the gap with their fastest moving merchants?
Well, I think the primary thing that we would advise a PSP is to really think about two things. What is the core of your merchant portfolio? So what are the needs and capabilities that you actually are serving that are actually best at? So, and this is where you have to create the best in class capabilities where you sort of think this is where I'm going to keep my volume. And then the second thing I would do, I would actually reduce the friction around integration, around supporting third parties, the wider ecosystem. Think about what partnerships I can create or that to enhance my offering where I do not have that core offering, because that both expands the ability for you to take merchants on who are not within that core persona or that core portfolio, the target group that you're looking at, but it also means that when those merchants are now thinking about what capabilities they might need that you don't have, you have an ecosystem answer around that, or at least you have you're giving your merchants an optionality that they can have an open discussion with you where they can potentially move some of the volume or some of the capabilities to other providers without necessarily losing the relationship with you, without feeling that they need to potentially default themselves from you and make an actual breakup. So I think the future is flexible. The future is such that merchants will be picking and choosing from the best in class capabilities for what they need. They will have access to orchestration tools that will allow them to do that more efficiently. And you can either work with that or be potentially the sort of the beast that people will think when to get rid of eventually.
So I always like to ask this question. It's the crystal ball question, right? So you won't be held accountable. I won't come to you in 5 years and go, you were wrong. So you can like go wild here, right? 5 years from now, what does the merchant and PSP relationship look like? Is it a strategic partnership or is it utility contract?
It's a good question because there's a number of forces that are impacting this right now. So we obviously have changes in the payments landscape. So with fragmentation of payment methods at the same time as we have more and more efforts put to actually create some interoperability between them, but that's obviously not happening anytime soon. We have agentic commerce and agentic AI, which might be potentially changing the way that PSPs and merchants and other industry players potentially interact. And we also have some changes in consumer behavior potentially, as well as, I think, regulators who are looking at a lot of this more and more. So if I were to take a bet, I would say that the market is going to be quite differentiated, because of a two-tier market. So I think it's going to be a utility market. So I think a lot of it is going to become utility at the basic core question of pricing and ability to support payment methods. I think that's going to become bread and butter and very similar between providers. It already is becoming quite similar between many providers, but I think there are certainly going to be differentiators, or there are going to be certain providers who will be best in class for certain value-added services, where that's around trust and authentication, where that's going to be around certain value-added services, where it's going to be about merchant financing and sort of really understanding specific risk categories. I don't think that's going to go away. And it's probably going to be even more important with the advent of the new technologies, with liability questions around agentic AI and so on, where you will want to have trusted partners for these types of journeys.
So lastly, great report. Where can our listeners go and get a copy of the report? How can they get hold of this? How can they read all this information?
So we are launching the report in 3 installments, just to keep the sort of the suspense high and to not to overfeed anyone on information. We are launching the first iteration of it entitled Merchants Going Shopping, and this is going to be exploring specifically the relationship between PSPs and merchants, specifically the way that merchants are reevaluating those relationships and thinking whether or not they're thinking about switching. And that was largely what we covered today. The second installment is going to be around the modern merchant payment stack. So thinking about the capabilities and investments that merchants are making in that space. And the third one will be around payments as a growth engine, as a revenue engine. So thinking more around that.
So where can a merchant find this report or a PSP?
The report will be available on our website, which is paymentgenes.com, and we will also be sharing it widely across the different media channels. So obviously LinkedIn, but also I'm sure you will find some of the ads elsewhere in your feed.
And we'll link to it in this podcast as well, so people watching the podcast will be able to find it. Thank you for your time today. Very, very interesting, and hopefully see you again on a future podcast.
Thank you, John. It was a pleasure talking to you. Have a great day.